Hello, everyone. Welcome to OA Week 2024. We will get started in just a moment. We're going to let a couple more of the attendees join. Okay, we will go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Catherine Brown, and I'm one of the GOA-ON coordinators for OA Week 2024. OA Week is presented by 4 sponsoring organizations. First, GOA-ON, the Global Ocean Acidification Observing Network. Second, NOAA OAP, the United States National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, their Ocean Acidification Program. Third, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the Ocean Acidification International Coordination Center. And last but not least, the IOC UNESCO, the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. GOA-ON was established in 2012 with just a handful of members, but since then it has grown immensely. It now has over 1,200 members from 114 countries. GOA-ON also consists of 10 regional hubs, which span across continents and oceanographic regions. We'll be hearing from most of them throughout OA Week 2024, so please check out some of the other sessions. If you're not a member yet, you can also join the GOA-ON network today by visiting the website that I will drop into the chat. OA Week debuted in 2020 and returned in 2021 when events and conferences were postponed due to COVID-19. Following the successful in-person symposium on the ocean and a high carbon dioxide world in 2022, and another successful OA Week in 2023, GOA-ON is bringing back OA Week 2024 to maintain momentum around ocean acidification research and to provide a virtual platform for the ocean acidification community to exchange their latest findings. During the session, all participants are in listen-only mode. You are welcome to type any questions into the questions box, which can be found at the bottom of the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We will be monitoring incoming questions and will pose them to our speakers during the Q&A section after all of the presentations. And with this, I would like to introduce you to your moderator for this session, Amy Kenworthy. As a science communicator, Amy is on a mission to amplify ocean literacy and nature connectedness through compelling storytelling, community engagement, and filmmaking. At Plymouth Marine Laboratories, she is the project officer for the Ocean Acidification Research for Sustainability program. She also works on the ProBleu program, creating teaching resources and films based on science that they do at the Plymouth Marine Laboratory. Amy, take it away.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So we'll get the slides up. I think Hula will be sharing our slides. So I'll just wait until that's ready. And just a quick disclaimer, I've been ill for a week and I'm still coughing. So I hope this all goes well, but if I start coughing too much, then Hula's going to take over. So during this session, we want to make it as interactive as possible. So we'd like to ask you to scan the QR code that you can see on the screen here. I'll just give you all a quick second to do that. There'll be opportunity as well later throughout the presentation to scan it again, which might make it easier. And also, please just let us know in the chat while you're doing that what your area of expertise is. If you're a scientist or a science communicator, maybe even policymaker, be really curious to see who we've got here today. Yeah, and then I'll just give this sort of couple more seconds. Hopefully you've all logged in. All right, so next slide, please. All right, so welcome to this session on communicating ocean acidification. Thank you so much for joining OA Week. So this OA Week is set out to highlight the OA knowledge we need to restore our relationship with the ocean. That was the theme for this year. And of course, for change to happen and for us to act on the best available science, it's really important that we don't just remain within our echo chambers, sort of only sharing our science with those who already recognize both its importance and that we need to act on it, and also how we need to act on it. So this session's really dedicated to sharing tools and strategies and creative approaches with you to help you strengthen your communication on ocean acidification and make your message resonate with diverse audiences. Developing these skills as scientists can help you break out of this echo chamber. But of course, as always, collaboration is really key for us to have a greater impact. And we'll also explore some of these different ways to collaborate between scientists and science communicators today. So joining us today, we have 4 speakers, each with years of experience in communicating complex topics and exploring solutions with various stakeholders. We're joined by Dr. Liz Perotti, who is NOAA's Ocean Acidification Program's Communication and Education Lead, serving as a liaison between scientists, educators, and communities affected by ocean, coastal, and Greater Lakes acidification. Her work aims to create, support, and facilitate greater ocean acidification literacy that leads to action. And Liz will speak about messaging about our changing oceans using best practices in a moment. We'll also be hearing from Jessie Turner, Executive Director of the OA Alliance, who's joining us from COP29 today. So thank you very much. And Liz is joining us very early in America. So thank you both of you. The OA Alliance brings together governments and organizations from across the globe dedicated to taking action to protecting coastal communities and livelihoods from the threat of ocean acidification and other climate ocean impacts. Jessie is also the co-champion of OARS Working Group 2 on Science to Action and 7 on policy engagement, and will speak about communicating to policymakers. We'll then hear about some examples of creative communication from Stéphanie Heckman, who's joined us today, a graphical recorder and visual facilitator based in Belfast in Ireland, and Juliana Corrales, communications lead and creative consultant with the OA Alliance, also freelance. And I'll introduce both of these properly when we get to that part of the session. So before we get started, again, we hope to make this session interactive. So throughout the session, there'll be a few questions that pop up, and we will ask you to use Menti to share your thoughts and experiences with us on these topics. And then later we'll go through those during the Q&A and kind of dive a bit deeper into what you've shared with us at the end of this presentation. So with that, let's move on to the next slide, please. Thank you again for joining, and I'll hand over to Liz.
Thank you, Amy, and welcome everyone. Great to see everyone in this session. As Amy mentioned, this is going to be a little bit interactive, and if you weren't able to use the QR code, you can just open up a tab called menti.com. And enter the 8-digit number, which will be at the top of each slide when we get to those sections. So that might be an easy way for you to participate. And it is anonymous, and you can insert as many responses as you feel like you'd like to share with us. So I appreciate that. As mentioned, today I'm going to be talking to you about best practices. Everything that you need to know about ocean acidification, you can find at our website at oceanacidification.noaa.gov. And you can also reach all of those resources that I'll be talking about today on our resources tab, and you can access that QR code as well. Next slide. So before we start, here we go. Here's the code, and you can open up a tab, menti.com. What we're going to do today is we're going to prompt you in different parts of these presentations to interact with us. And at the end, we'll go through the answers and see what everyone had to contribute to kind of jumpstart the discussion. So the first thing that we'd like people to let us know are, what are your goals for ocean acidification communication? So these could be personal goals, it could be goals of your organization, it could be goals that you may or may not be reaching yet. So please let us know in that Menti tab. And again, you can go to menti.com and type in that 8-digit code you see there at the top, 6207-5516. We'll just give people a minute to populate those. All right, and the second question, you could press skip if you choose not to answer one of the questions on your tab, or you can just go to the next question. And the second one are, what are your biggest challenges with communicating ocean acidification? So this could be related to resources, it could be related to capacity, it could be related to your own personal comfort in talking about parts of ocean acidification, which is a very complex topic, as we all know. Please let us know. Hopefully today's presentations will help you think of ways to address some of those big challenges. All right, thank you. Feel free to stay in menti.com as we go through this presentation. What I'm going to do for you today, since I'm talking about best practices based on cognitive science and social science, is I'm just going to give a lot of examples of how I might talk about it, and then examples of what I actually use from cognitive and social science to communicate this complex topic. But of course, these are examples and you would modify it for your own particular messages or your own particular work around ocean or coastal acidification. So I'm just going to start with this one image of our planet taken from above the Earth, and that band over our planet is our atmosphere, of course. And our atmosphere acts like a blanket around the Earth that traps heat. And when we burn fossil fuels like gas and coal, doing activities we do every day, like driving our cars, using electricity, we add gases to this heat trapping blanket. And the more gases we add, this blanket gets thicker and traps more heat, causing warming of our planet and changing the way it functions. We're already seeing rising sea levels, changes in storm patterns and heat waves, changes to marine life that people value in our communities already, and as well as the industries and people who really depend on them. Reducing the amount of these heat trapping gases is an important solution, and we can take practical common steps that set steps now to protect our environment and livelihoods well into the future. All right, so next slide. So what did we just do? What we did in this example is we relied on cognitive science, which tells us to use a metaphor to break down a complex topic, and we introduced it early. In this case, it's that idea of a heat trapping blanket. And this has been actually tested through social science as something that resonates with many audiences, and it's something that conveys correctly what we know about the phenomenon, but it does it in a way that uses common words, common parlance, in ways that people can understand. We corrected some common misconceptions, for example, the cause of what's happening with this heat trapping blanket. And we did that by providing a specific mechanism. We also did something that might be very important, which is completing the explanatory chain. And what that means is we're connecting all the dots for our audience. Social science and cognitive science tell us that when people don't know a particular thing about something that's happening, they actually fill in that gap with information they already know, and this often leads to misconceptions. And the risk of that is that they either take the wrong action or they take inaction. And that, of course, is often not one of our goals in communicating about ocean acidification or any other complex topic that we'd want to talk about our science. Finally, we put individuals into communities. You'll notice I used words like atmosphere, our planet, our ocean. And social science shows us that when you give people that community thinking sense, they tend to do more action and the correct actions rather than a single action. So often if you tell people and something that you can do now, they tend to do that one thing, kind of check the box, feel good about it, and then they stop there. But really what we need to do in order to address big challenges is to have a community level wide response. And that's one way we can get people into that community thinking, is by using that type of language. Finally, I used what's called a tested value. And the one I used here is called responsible management. And that was that last statement I said of, we can use practical common sense steps now to safeguard our future for the environment and livelihoods. So that is specifically developed by the Frameworks Institute as a value that resonates with audiences across a spectrum of perspectives on earth and ocean change. And it tends to resonate with those audiences. It gets them into a productive mindset. It shuts down some misconceptions and shuts down unproductive mindsets that don't lead to action. What else we did is we also gave people a specific solution. And of course, with your particular messaging, your call to action or your solution that you want people to enact might be different. Next slide, please. So now that we've kind of talked about an underlying cause of ocean acidification, kind of like that big step back, how does that connect? Oh, go back one slide. It looks like we skipped a slide. There we go. Okay, it looks like we're missing a slide. I'll just mention it here. The next thing we need to do is connect that to the ocean. And one of the things that we would do, it should read as the ocean as climate's heart. And that's another metaphor that has been evaluated through social science. And the story we're telling with that metaphor is, just as the heart circulates blood and regulates the body's temperature, the ocean controls the circulation of heat and moisture throughout the system, throughout the global system. And, just as when we burn fossil fuels, like those heat trapping gases, it traps heat in our atmosphere, that heat puts stress on the ocean and it damages its ability to keep the system stable. And so by saying that, that facilitates thinking about how the ocean can be harmed by specific activities and frames the problem within a particular context. We can say as a result of the stress, sometimes the ocean pumps too much heat or too little heat and moisture throughout the system. And this provides an explanation of why there are different effects of our world and earth change in different parts of the world. And then finally, we can say, as the heart must be monitored and cared for in order to ensure overall health and functioning, we also need to care for our ocean. And then we can move on to our call to action. Next step. Oh, sorry, go back one. Great. So now that we've connected underlying cause to the ocean, now we need to get into ocean acidification, and that's our carbon problem, right? So we can talk about the ocean as a great carbon sponge, and the story we're telling is how the ocean's role of absorbing carbon has not only the benefits of regulating our climate system, but also confers consequences with that greater absorption, and that is changing ocean chemistry, and that's what we call ocean acidification. Next slide. Often what we want to emphasize is ocean acidification is happening now. I think this is one of the biggest challenges for people in communicating ocean acidification, is having to talk about chemistry. Ocean acidification isn't something like wildfires or marine plastics where it's very easy and tangible to see. As we all know, even the term ocean acidification ignites some anxiety with many audiences because it's a chemistry, it sounds like a chemistry term, and people feel like lack confidence often in this area. And so often what might be the best approach is to focus on the consequences of changing ocean chemistry or the consequences of ocean acidification, and to start there. Next slide. However, if you do need to tackle that chemistry talk, some best practices and the ways we talk about it are this. One of the common criticisms when you start talking about ocean acidification is, oh, the ocean isn't acidic. That's correct. So you always want to give the caveat of, while the ocean is not acidic, one consequence is increasing acidity. And so you want to use that term increasing acidity rather than becoming more acidic in order to address that using the proper language. And that tends to resonate with audiences and doesn't shut them down and makes them into a more productive mindset. We can also then further that by talking about how even small increases in acidity can have big consequences. And often people will refer to an analogy of within our bodies, even small changes in that, changes in the acidity in our blood can cause major impacts to our system. And we see the same kind of potential consequences with marine life in the ocean. Often in educational settings, educators might actually have to talk about the specific chemistry. And one thing that has been shown to be effective is talking about hydrogen ions as acting as free agents. And these free agents can compete with other chemicals that some marine life need to make a living. And then you can move on to talk more about the importance of those consequences. Next slide. So let's get into some other effective ways to talk about ocean acidification without having to dive into chemistry. One thing is, and this is supported by our science, is that ocean acidification is an energy problem. And so we can say things like ocean acidification makes it harder for some marine life to get mineral building blocks they need to build and maintain their shells and skeletons. And marine life can spend more energy building or maintaining these shells and skeletons, energy that could be used for things like finding food, avoiding predators, and reproducing and creating that next generation. Those are things that people can understand, and we didn't have to talk about chemistry, but we did actually talk about things that are supported by science. And of course, here is where you might incite specific examples of your particular work or of research supported examples. The other thing is non-lethal problems are also problems. So, one thing that isn't happening is, ocean acidification isn't going out there and killing all of marine life. But there are non-lethal impacts that can be important and cascade throughout our ecosystems and impact communities and industries of people who depend on the health of those ecosystems. So we can say things like both fish and crabs deal with impacts to their sensing systems, and that can impact how they survive and thrive. And we're learning more about their development, genetics, and generational consequences of ocean acidification. And here's where you can insert examples of species or ecosystems and habitats that people care about. And finally, what has emerged to be both important and supported by science is that putting the ocean acidification in that multi-stressor context. Species face a lot of stresses from our changing ocean. Other stresses like warming temperatures, pollution, lower oxygen can make it harder for marine life to deal with ocean acidification. And in turn, ocean acidification can make it harder for them to deal with those other stresses. So that's another way that we can start to talk about the consequences that are happening now to get people engaged into the conversation, and then step back and use those other metaphors as needed to kind of connect those dots for your audience. Next slide. I think one of the most important things we can do is to listen and meet people where they are. And by that, I mean, figure out what it is they value and care about and focus your communications around that. So each audience is going to have their own, you should be catering your communications to each audience. And if you don't know what concerns your particular audience, any information that you can gather to do that would be beneficial to providing an effective communication campaign. Connecting that to one of those trusted values that the Frameworks Institute has created. I gave the example of responsible management. Protection is the other one. And you can find Frameworks Institute cards outlining step-by-step how to use them on our website. And then, of course, talking about those actions, leaving people with that sense of hope, sense that they are part of this bigger community and effort to address the impacts of ocean and coastal acidification. Next slide. Consider telling stories of resilience. So often what we can do is say, this is how our science and our knowledge systems have actually helped us address and prepare for these impacts that are happening now and are going to continue to happen, and how we've helped mitigate. So, thinking about what species are more resilient, what species show resilience, when are they during their life history, species that show adaptive capacity. Think about like human communities that have taken action based on our knowledge and research, examples of knowledge in action. And I'm saying knowledge because not only scientific knowledge, but also other ways of knowing. And then that knowledge community, knowledge and community or knowledge and industry partnerships that have shown to solve these problems, where that we've been able to mitigate the impacts or been able to support people as they prepare to adapt. Next slide. So I'll wrap up here, but there are a bunch of resources for you on our resources tab on our website, and that is oceanacidification.noaa.gov. And on our resources tab, you can use our searchable database to find like particular best practices, like the cards that I had mentioned, different types of media, different types of multimedia, search for specific audiences and materials catered to those particular audiences to kind of get you started with your own communications. And we're adding to that collection by vetting through our program to ensure that they do meet those communications best practices that I've talked about. And so feel free to use that resource. Also in development is a new communications best practices guide, and I'm seeking contributors and reviewers for that. And if you're interested, please contact me with that, and I'll put my email into the chat here in a moment. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Amy, our moderator.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Liz. That was really incredible. Liz is also a member of Working Group 6 of OARS, which is focused on public awareness. So it's really wonderful to have her on board and this wealth of knowledge that she's bringing. And yeah, I'm hoping that our working group can contribute both to this best practices guide, but also then put it into practice. So that's the hope for OARS Working Group 6 moving forward. Thank you so much. So if we have the next slide, please. Great, thank you. So our next speaker is going to be Jessie Turner from the OA Alliance, and I'll hand it over to Jessie to ask the next set of questions for Menti. So if you haven't already, then just scan that QR code and join there. And I also put a link in the chat to the Menti if that's easier for you. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Amy, but I'm going to put it right back to you to ask those questions because I don't have them right in front of me, so I apologize in real time. And you're on mute.
Thank you. Okay, so our question is, have you communicated directly with government? So if everyone just goes back to Menti and just let us know if you've communicated directly with governments, maybe also if it's indirectly at conferences or in any other way. We'd be keen to hear about that. And then our second question will be, what are your goals when communicating with governments? So I'll just update those. Right, we'll just give it a couple of seconds for you to answer that, and then we'll hand over. Yeah, Liz just put in the chat, yeah, tell us about your local, regional and national governments. So it doesn't have to be conferences, it can be at all sorts of. Great. All right, we'll leave it at that. You can still update it while Jessie's talking, but if you think of something, but over to you now, Jessie.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Amy, and for the organizers, the GOA-ON Secretariat for inviting us to participate in this. I know it's going to be a great session. I'm really excited for the following presentations as well. But hello and forgiveness and patience in advance. I found a little quiet spot here at COP29 to hopefully pull over with a little bit less noise, but we'll see if it gets too much. You can let me know. I'm also quite excited to see the answers to that presentation about, or to the question in the Menti about goals when you're communicating with governments. But I'll go ahead and just talk for maybe about 10 minutes and I'll make sure that I don't run over. Or if I do, I'll be conscious about it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about communicating ocean acidification to governments. And, you know, as Liz was mentioning, one of the big things that we're trying to talk a little bit more about is how we think about advancing the narrative on ocean acidification. And if you go to the next slide, one of my favorites is I stole from a colleague of mine, Carol Turley, a colleague of yours from Plymouth Marine Lab, and looking at different search results around ocean acidification on Google over the years. So she started this slide a couple of years back and looking at in 2003, you know, there were 17, you know, hits on what is ocean acidification. And as we go forward to this year, you know, we've got almost 12 million, you know, results. And I think what that really tells us on the next slide is that when we think about this is that awareness in some instances is growing. But what that really means is that we need to be thinking about ocean acidification for different audiences and for discrete outcomes, right? That was very much what Liz is talking about with this communications for action, not just for an understanding. And that we really want to move from describing what is ocean acidification only to why does it matter and what can different actors do to address acidification. And yes, we don't know everything in every parts of the in all parts of the world, but we know enough to be taking action in every part of the world. So if you go on to the next slide, we'll just talk again a little bit about what these OA calls to action might be. How do we think about an OA call to action? And I guess the first thing to bring our attention to is, you know, what do policymakers even need to take action? You know, what motivates them? What's the sort of thing that you need to bring to their office, bring, you know, as in this, bring yourself into the mindset of? And the first couple of things are simply elements for informing policy. Well, kind of like a lot of partnerships, you need exposure of this topic, sometimes exposure as yourself, as a researcher, as a trusted actor in this space. And that leads to the second point of trust. You need to be, you know, forming a relationship with a person in order for them to really understand. For policy making, you really want to account for a concern, but not only just accounting for that concern, you need to account for it in a local context. And that's something that, you know, we'll talk a little bit more about what policymakers need for something that's a little bit more regionalized, a little bit more localized to their experience. And of course, to the constituents that they're serving and to the policies that they're trying to provide outcomes for people in their areas. And then, of course, the big thing is offering a solution. That's a short-term and a long-term solution. I think a lot of times we just want to go and we want to wave a flag and elevate an issue, but rarely do we think about bringing recommendations for what those next steps might be. Remember that policymakers are not experts on ocean acidification. I promise you they are not. And you are the expert. And so being able to come with some nudges about what next steps that policymaker can do to be helpful very much is consistent with this, you know, an OA call to action to be helpful. So in the next slide, just a couple of good housekeeping measures. You know, first of all, as we said, you know, policymakers are not ocean acidification experts. So do not assume that your audience understands OA, even the short abbreviation. They don't. And so we really need to state clearly why a finding, a potential impact, or an unanswered question matters. Let's see, Amy, I left slides on my screen, but making sure that that's...
Yeah, no, I can't see them anymore either. Ah, okay, we're back. Thank you.
Cool. So again, just really making sure that you're not leaving anything to the, as Liz said, you know, filling in the gaps. You don't want to leave any gaps there for them to be filled in. And then the second point is don't assume your audience understands what should be done. Oftentimes we want to go and say, look at this finding. And the second part we don't say is, isn't it obvious that XYZ steps should be taken? And it is not clearly obvious for anyone else why that next step should be taken. You know, you're so uniquely situated to understand that. And so we really need to be communicating with that patients in mind. So you really need to state clearly what's missing and how it might be addressed. All right, next slide. So when that comes back to ocean acidification, what do policymakers really want to know about when it comes to acidification? And on the next slide, the general policy questions that we get constantly through the Alliance, reaching out to policymakers all the time, who might have no context for acidification at all. Some of them might have a little bit of awareness that it's caused by climate change, or they say greenhouse gas emissions, but they're not even necessarily clear on the carbon connection. The big thing they want to know is, how will taking OA action actually help implement or inform existing goals, policies, targets they already have? Governments have made loads of climate commitments. They've made loads of ocean management or ocean policy commitments, ecosystem health commitments, community health resilience, blue economy commitments. And they really don't want to make any more commitments, so going and saying we needed a whole new ocean acidification pillar sometimes is not going to be a big draw. So you want to make sure that you can couch it into this existing landscape that governments are already thinking about and have policies moving forward. The second thing, as we talked about, is what can be done, and specifically what can be done now versus later. I used to work for a representative in Washington State Legislature. And people would come to him all the time with super meritorious issues, all the good things that we want to do for healthy communities or healthy environments, that we can think of. And he would sometimes say, well, I'm not on that committee, so there's nothing I can do about it at this stage. If you're asking for my vote on this committee, that will be at this certain time, and so that's a little bit of an exaggerated example, just to give you a sense that they really want to be able to do something specific. And if we can't ask them for something specific, like an OA action, it's harder to have that conversation. And that kind of leads us to which actors are responsible for different activities. Someone might say, well, that's actually not my wheelhouse. You need to talk to somebody down the road or down the office or at a different department or a different level of governance. And that's one way to think about mapping some of these different actors and these different calls to action for them. Next slide. And so this is another element where, once we kind of get into what can be done now versus later, policymakers often want to know is, how is ocean acidification different than other climate issues? Is there anything we can do now that's going to make a difference other than reducing CO2 emissions? That's a big one that governments come back to us with, and they say, we're already working to reduce CO2 emissions. What more do you want us to do? Leave us alone. This is just one more trend tracking issue. And so it's really important that we can bring it down and say, no, there are some very specific things that we can do on acidification, inclusive of reducing CO2 emissions and exclusive of reducing CO2 emissions. And starting to name some of those things is a really big opportunity to help them see the potential for some of these resilience building strategies around the coastline, things that are going to reduce stress on ecosystems, on ecosystem function, and that when you think about OA combined with these other issues like warming, oxygen loss, pollution, and nutrient loading, we can do a lot to reduce that combined stress on ecosystems. And that's something we can be pointing them to. And then finally, on the deep dive of what do they want to know, they often want to know what are the species, economies, communities that might be impacted, and more specifically, back to the local point, are they in my region? What's their significance to me as and the types of constituencies that I represent? Is this an economic, a cultural, a subsistence fishery that's important to us? And I think those are, or there's a food chain issue that we're talking about. And those are all really important things to help policymakers understand in that type of socioeconomic context. And I want to point out what Liz said, which I really appreciated, which is, I think a lot of times policymakers are coming to us and if we haven't seen a collapse, of an industry, they think that maybe there's not evidence for that type of harm on acidification. And I think instead of sort of looking to these drastic ocean acidification, isolated collapse instances, we really need to be talking about OA as this energy problem or this non-lethal problem when we're talking about impact. So I really appreciated and echo that slide that Liz had, and how we can incorporate that type of messaging when we're talking to policymakers, I think is a great way to go. All right, so next slide. Once we get them through, is there anything we can do about it? Is this different than a climate change issue? Is it different than CO2? Are there other things we can be doing? What species might be impacted in my region, and why does that matter to me? the next set of questions they're going to ask is around their priorities. You know, everyone's going to say there's only so much time and money to invest. So how do we think about what areas are most at risk and why? Are there different species, different geographic locations, coastal areas, industries that might be more vulnerable or more resilient to these ocean changes? And is there a practical, approach to thinking about outlining science that's going to have targeted applicability to addressing some of those issues? And again, making sure that that can complement and maybe even be integrated into existing efforts is a great way to help them and help ourselves think about the priorities that we want and to see in our OA work. So moving on, developing our calls to action. And now we've sort of gone through this list of what policymakers are generally thinking about and what we want to relay to them. As I mentioned earlier, there are different calls to action on ocean acidification. So let's just run down the list here quickly, make sure we're great. And so the number one, obviously, is reducing carbon dioxide emissions. We've talked about that and different policies to do so. That is, in my book, definitely an OA action, is all policies that work to reduce CO2 emissions. The second thing that sounds maybe like it's raising awareness or explaining acidification, but it's actually elevating the profile of ocean acidification. And so that can be a call to action to a policymaker to say, we need to talk about this more. You know, is this something that you can begin to socialize and incorporate when you're talking about your climate change concerns or responses, when you're talking about ocean health and ecosystem health? And that's a direct call to action that we can be making to policymakers. Obviously, we want them to understand what OA activities are happening in their own country or their own area or region and help set priorities. So that's a pretty specific one, is just understanding the local OA activities is a call to action we might make to a policymaker. Funding OA monitoring and research is a very specific call to action. Helping coordinate OA monitoring and research is another very specific call to action. One that we work a lot at the Alliance about is including or accounting for OA in mainstream policy priorities, which again is a little bit more narratively to inserting the topic of acidification and in mainstream policy versus that last bullet, which is integrating OA information into management practices. That's a little bit more hands-on adaptation and mitigation strategies. But those are all different types of calls to action. And I just want us to think about them because often we say, we want you to advance work on acidification, but we don't talk exactly about what that might be. And then going on to the next slide, and I will start to speed things up, I promise, Amy. We also have different actions for different people. And so very much as Liz was saying, we've got national, state, or even local policymakers that are policy leads maybe for climate change, marine management, fisheries, coastal, or like economy, blue economy, sustainable fisheries policies. But we also have things like resilience managers and marine resource managers that are maybe in charge of a specific type of fishery, specific type of vegetation. We also have coastal developers or coastal zone managers that might have a little bit more interaction with land development and thinking about that pollution side, water quality regulators and managers. And then of course, we also have maybe outside the policy space, just wanted to add it in here, other scientists. Oftentimes, a lot of the work with acidification is cross-pollinating this into other science disciplines or working with other science disciplines. And so that is, I think, a key audience that we want to be thinking about how we're reaching out to. And also funders of science. Also, sometimes we need to understand why their contribution in a specific OA action might be helpful. And then, of course, industry and seafood growers and many others that I know you all think about and interact with. And then almost last to not least, I just wanted to help us troubleshoot a little bit about, you're up against the wall, you go into a meeting you go into an engagement, you really want to talk to this person of influence, whether it's a policymaker or otherwise, and get them to think about a specific OA action. And a lot of the types of wall that you're going to get is going to sound a little bit like this. Some of it might be as facetious as like, who are you and do you vote for me? Sometimes, like I said, if you're not a constituent, they might not feel like they're responsible, to working on something that is outside their issue, or outside their jurisdiction. The second is you'll hear a lot of like, we already work on conservation issues. We already have marine protected areas, so don't worry. And that's something that I think it's good practice for us to help troubleshoot out of a little bit, to say, yes, that's great. We already have some conservation measures in marine protected areas, but how much more robust might decisions around those marine protected areas or other conservation measures be if we have more targeted information? Again, thinking about that needing locally or regionally relevant information. And if we don't have local information, we can highlight the local information gap to say, this is actually the gap we need to be closing because we don't know enough in our area. And then I talked about the responsibilities, and I talked a little bit about the task making, right? So is there anything that we can give them as a task today, next year, 3 years from now? And also thinking about doing some homework in advance of how this ask might be complementing or integrating into existing efforts that they're already prioritizing. And I'll just leave you, we have some worksheets through the OA Alliance. We can drop them in the chat for sure. But we put together, there was an IAEA communications training that we supported or provided some input to last year. And we developed these little worksheets. And one of them is just examples of OA calls to action, helping walk people through, you know, what's the objective that we're trying to accomplish here? Who's our policy audience? What's the call to action that's actually going to support our objective? And then what are the specific types of engagement pathways, whether it's a meeting or something different than a meeting, you know, and communications materials that might support that. And then I'll just go to I'll go ahead and skip over 20, you know, just thinking how we can better shape OA calls to action. And then our last worksheet is a little bit more specificity. Oh, go on back, Amy. Sorry, a little bit more specificity about how to contextualize a specific OA activity that we're trying to get supported, right? So these worksheets that will give you some prompts to talk about that OA activity that you really specifically want support on, the policy or government priority that action might most align with, the government entity responsible for it. And then if we can help think about that short-term or that long-term request, having those things lined up in advance of communicating with policymakers will go a long way into making that communication a little bit easier, I think. So that's all I'll leave you with for now. But thanks so much for inviting us. Again, we'll put some links to some of these resources that we talked about from the IAEA training, both maybe on the OARS website and then also following it from this session. So thanks, Amy, and everyone who's participating and putting this together.
Thank you so much, Jessie. That was really informative, and I think a lot there to learn for all of us. And I think Jessie will have to leave us now, as like she said, she's at COP, so she's gonna probably head off at some point and put all the things that she just spoke about into practice. So really, as well, it'll be interesting to hear through the OA Alliance how that all went at COP and what progress was made and what connections were made. So I'm looking forward to hearing about that, and also through OARS Working Group 7, of course, we'll find inspiration there. So thank you so much for that. All right, we're going to move on to our next session or section of the session, where we'll talk about some examples of creative communication that hopefully will inspire you. So we'll now hear from Stéphanie Heckman, who since 2018 has been working with close to 200 organizations, focusing on supporting those advancing climate action, peace and reconciliation, and leadership development. And as a graphical recorder and visual facilitator, she translates in real-time collective conversations into hand-drawn visual summaries that distill the essence of both content and undercurrent. I met Stéphanie during the UN Ocean Decade conference this year in Barcelona, and I was sat a row behind her, and I just joined this session on, I think it was ocean chemistry, and was finding it quite hard to understand everything that was going on. It's not my background, so it was finding it hard to keep up. And I saw her drawing away on her tablet, and I was really curious. So afterwards, I approached her, and she showed me what she'd just drawn, and it was basically a visual representation of that session. And it was absolutely incredible for me, because I could see that I could then pick out sort of what they'd been saying and made more sense to me. And she went on to tell me a bit more about her work, and ever since I've been telling anyone that I can about her work, because I think it has huge potential for impact and does have impact around the world. So I'm going to hand over to Stéphanie now. But before we do that, there will be also on the Mentimeter, sorry, I forgot, the next question, where we'd like to ask you, have you seen any good examples of OA storytelling? So you can either reply to that now or just later on. Great. Over to you, Stephanie. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. And thanks for those very generous introductory words. So Amy invited me to share a little bit about the work that I do. And it comes with a bit of introduction, right? Some people may be familiar with graphic recording, others have seen it for the first time. So I'm taking a few minutes here just to explain the work that I do and why I do it, or the added value that I see it can offer in scenarios where the content is quite complex and technical. And I'll show you also some examples of doing this work in the context of ocean science in particular. So these are some recent examples of ocean science related work. And next slide, please. This is just the overview of what it is that I do. So visual practice is a kind of common denominator here. And within that, there's really two things that I do most. The first one is graphic recording. And so here, as you can see on the picture, I'm essentially making a visual summary of the essence of the content during conversations, usually at conferences, but it can be at trainings, it can be at stakeholder engagement sessions, it can be internal meetings, anywhere where people gather and think and talk together. There's content that can be harvested in this visual way. So that is a role that sits on the sideline really, and it's a role of witness to and on behalf of the conversation that's happening in the room. Visual facilitation is slightly more interactive in the sense that I'm using visual tools to facilitate or help facilitate a group conversation. And participants in that conversation can help contribute to the visual output that comes out of the end of the session. So the photograph that you see there is an example of, it's still a physical board with illustrations on it, but here the participants are directly contributing their own thoughts and their own handwriting, maybe some doodles if they dare, to add to the visual output. So those are the two formats that I work in most. And just to show that can happen in person, but it can happen digitally, remotely as well. Next slide, please. And so this is an excerpt of from a white paper I wrote on my visual practice work in the context of multilateral climate change negotiations, just to show what I've seen it do for participants as part of those conversations. And I think a key added value here is an overview of what can be very complex, challenging and technical conversations and discussions, to have everything in one glance. It can be a lot in one glance, but still it's all there on one page. That's the idea of these graphic recordings. And so on that one page, you can begin to see the patterns, what was said a lot that might have gained more prominence in terms of it takes up more space on the graphic recording, or, different delegates have mentioned similar things, or you can see the contrast, but you can begin to surface the patterns within complex conversations. And, both Liz and Jessie spoke to the importance of connecting the dots and filling in the gaps for the people you talk to. This type of graphic recording work can assist in that as well. There's an element there of recognition. So when people speak, to see themselves and their contributions reflected, that's particularly just very important in a multilateral process where it's important that everybody is heard. But there's something there that I think is most relevant when it comes to also the session that we're talking about today, which is around access. And so access to information. We were talking, or Liz was talking in her earlier part of the session about meeting people where they are at. And so how can we use metaphors? How can we use real world examples? In this presentation already, there were lots of pictures of the different organisms affected by ocean acidification, because it's something that a wider public will be able to relate to or recognize. And so we can use real world examples, we can use metaphors, we can use the stories and analogies that people mention during these conversations and make them visible. You know, Jessie talked about helping people see. This is like, we're actually making it visible. So we are lowering, in a sense, thresholds to access information, to translate it into language that can be easy to understand, and also imagery that helps people process information in a different way. And so just to say one thing about the importance of both words and images. So it's not that I am proselytizing here that images should take over from big reports altogether. Words are really important and details important. I think particularly in the context of scientific work, the detail and the technical detail is very important, but something that sits alongside that can help introduce people into that detail, or help them get the essence of it. So, you know, these graphic recordings have been described as the executive summary in a visual way that sits alongside a big report on a process. Next slide, please. So just to show some examples, I've picked out examples from recent work that were related to ocean science, often in the context of climate change negotiations. So this one is from a year and a half ago in Bonn, the UNFCCC Ocean and Climate Change Dialogue. And just to show on the left, you can see the output, the official output from the session, which was the summary report. And these graphic recordings and sat inside that report as a way to kind of grab the attention, but also show the key messages and the key themes writ large in one overview. And so the messages for COP28 that you can see along the top of that graphic recording there, they were actually the key output from this session. This was part of a subsidiary body session to prepare for COP28. And this is an example of a graphic recording that was made in real time there in the plenary hall alongside the conversations that were happening. And an example of physical in-person graphic recording work. Next slide, please. And this is just to show you a slightly different way of working. So this was an example of visual facilitation where it was more interactive. Remember, these were facilitated breakout sessions, about 20 of them. They all had templates to note down their key points on. And so what we ended up with was 20 sheets full of information you can see in the middle there. And that needed to be digested into something of a summary, but a visual summary. So in a session that Jessie, I think, was a part of as one of the table facilitators for these breakout sessions, we then pulled all of this content together, visualized it, and in a co-creative session, co-design session, ended up with, on the next slide, please. This was the more infographic style output from that session. And so there's a lot of content and detail on here, but it was co-created alongside the ocean science experts, of which I'm not one. I can be the filter to make the information more understandable and accessible to a wider audience, but I can work alongside the experts in the room to make sure it's accurate, and the detail, the technical detail, is in there as well. And the final example, next slide, please. Just to show you an example of doing this work, not physically, but remotely. This was done for an ocean climate change session the year before that, so the UNFCCC Ocean Climate Change Dialogue in 2022, which I didn't attend in person, but I attended remotely. And so this was the summary graphic recording based on the summary notes from the rapporteurs. And again, this sat alongside the more detailed comprehensive report and was used, you can see a little screenshot of a tweet there from the Ocean Climate Platform with Sir Peter Thompson, presenting the graphic recording as part of his presentation a month later at the UN Ocean Conference. So just to show 3 examples very quickly of this work in action. And on the next slide, and that's my final one, and just to show, if you bring it down to the very basics, this work can also be simple. So me and some colleagues teach workshops and helping scientists and policymakers translate their own work into simple visuals to help some of that work around visualizing content, making it visible for a wider audience, and how to communicate perhaps beyond the conventional circuits that they're used to communicating within. And at the top left there, that shell is a quick interpretation of how to visualize ocean acidification. Just a little takeaway there from my perspective as an artist. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Really beautiful work. And yeah, great to see as well, like that you and Jessie have already worked together. So I put Stephanie's website in the chat. So if you're looking for any kind of creative outputs for your research, do definitely get in touch with her and see what's possible there. It's a really great way to make your research more accessible, or your sessions that you might be facilitating if you're doing stakeholder engagement workshops or something like that. So yeah, thank you so much. And I think Stephanie will be around later as well for the Q&A. So our final speaker is Juliana Corrales, who has over 10 years of experience in creative communications and a master's in sustainable natural resource management. Julia's multidisciplinary experience at an international level gives a unique perspective that allows her to better engage with all stakeholders to create innovative communication products. So thank you, Julia, for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you, Amy. Can you hear me well? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, good. Okay. So thank you for that invitation and that nice introduction. So yeah, I'm going to show you some of the creative communication projects that we have developed with the OAA Alliance in the past few years. These days at the Alliance, we're finding new and more creative ways of making these unseen impacts that we have all been mentioning throughout of climate ocean change seen and most importantly, emotionally felt. And we're using creative narrative building and storytelling. And I will show you a few of the examples we've implemented so far. Okay, so this first project was developed back in 2023 in collaboration with NOAA Ocean Acidification Program, aka LIS, and their team, and the Aquarium Conservation Partnership. Exploring our changing ocean impacts and responses to ocean acidification in the US resulted in the creation of 6 story maps with the aim to advance communications about climate ocean changes occurring regionally in the US by presenting localized information on unique impacts, responses, and calls to action taking shape across the country. The primary audience were visitors to US aquariums or marine learning centers, and with the aim to be used in displays and exhibits in these institutions. The story maps showcased relevant ocean acidification trends, science activities, stakeholder engagements, and policy responses taking place across regions where NOAA supports US coastal acidification networks. The project goals were to increase understanding about the impacts of carbon emissions on our ocean, reach new audiences, which is where the ACP, Aquarium Conservation Partnership, really helped us, and accelerate calls to action. Usually with this type of big issues, it's difficult to give like the individual, the one person, like what can I do? Sometimes you feel a bit helpless. And with this project, we try to develop calls to action tailored to this specific audience to help move OA activities from science to action taking. So as you can see here, these are the calls to actions we developed to cement the idea that in the face of climate change, we have a collective responsibility and we all actually have something to do. So it's kind of like taking what Liz said, like into like something tangible. So what can I do? Use my voice. So you can go. We're gonna share the link later on the chat. So the next project I want to present is the Ocean Acidification Poetry Campaign. So basically this following two projects is kind of like meeting everyone where they are, in the sense that we all are humans and we all experiment this world through similar experience through poetry. We've all been exposed to poetry or storytelling. So it's just like bringing that into this space too. So we released our first poetry social media campaign for this year's UN World Oceans Day. This project was designed to initiate a new storytelling pathway for OA Alliance members and partners that inspired emotional connection. Poetry can be a cathartic opportunity to express emotions, either good or bad, that arise when working on this field. World Ocean Day happened to align with the Immersed in Change conference in Costa Rica, where we launched the campaign during one of our events. You can see the image in the top left. And here I am showing a few of the haikus that were submitted. And as you can see from some of these examples, the poems were written by those working within the climate ocean community. They captured the reality of the crisis and the tireless efforts to expand knowledge and find solutions for the impacts of OA. A selection of these poems was included in the most recent online volume of Sea Voice magazine, and you can also find the whole collection on the OA Alliance website. And we're trying to like give them like more use to bring another like face, another way of describing OA from the practitioner. The last intervention that I'm gonna mention is this storytelling intervention that we organized at the Ocean Decade Conference this year in Barcelona. We co-hosted an event at the conference, but before we jumped into the nitty-gritty of moving from science into action for OA, which was the event's title, we sat in a circle, as you can see in the photos here, and shared some stories and connected in a different way. The OA Alliance held this space for the participants because we believe that sharing our experiences through storytelling can be a great form of expressing our unique relationship to this topic. And it also has the power to generate understanding, foster connection, and remind us that we are not alone in our efforts. So for half an hour, we shared some of the stories that led us to work in OA, stories inspired by the hardships of this work, and even some stories honoring those who are not here with us anymore, but that played a significant role on where we are now. So it just gave a very different environment to then jumping into the more rational. So it connected us more like that human and emotional level. But yeah, that's it from me. Thank you so much. I will be sharing some of the links to the OA Alliance communications resources. We've mentioned some that Jessie mentioned and some that I will copy them in the chat. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Hula. Yeah, I was at that storytelling session at the Ocean Decade Conference, and it was really wonderful and brought tears to my eyes a few times. So, and it also filled the room with laughter, and just, yeah, it was a really beautiful experience. So thank you. If we go to the next slide, we've got our final question for the Menti poll. So if you go back onto Menti, and then I'll just give you a few seconds to, or a minute or so, to sort of answer this. question. And then that will also be, that's the end of our presentations. And we have another 20 minutes on this session. So what we're going to do is have a bit of a Q&A session. I think you haven't got the option to speak, but if you put your hand up, then Catherine can unmute you, and then you can you can talk directly, because it'd be nice to have sort of an open conversation and discussion about this. Also, I'll have a look if I can share my screen and show you then also the results from the Menti. And maybe we go like that, and then we can see if we want to talk about it, or maybe there's some direct questions already there for the speakers. But just while you're doing that, thank you so much to our 4 speakers today. I definitely learned a lot. I hope everyone else did as well. And it's a real honor to be working with all of you in various capacities and areas. So thank you so much. Great. Okay, so if there's anyone wants to fill out the Mentimeter, then I'll give that another second, and then we'll go to the start of it. Great, and I think there's still some links being put in the chat as well. All right. Does that work? Great. Okay. All right. Let's go back to the start. I think this might be our first question, which was at the start of Liz's presentation. So what are your goals for ocean acidification communication? Finding analogies to help communicate complex issues more easily, stakeholder engagement, increase general awareness of OA, reach people who are not aware, not the choir, for the general public to understand what it is, what causes it, what are the consequences, what can be done. OA is both invisible and slow onset, making it difficult to explain. Help people understand how they can be a part of the solution, and to communicate the urgency of the situation without overwhelming people. To learn how I might be able to integrate OA research into my citizen science project. That's really great. And communicate local news about ocean acidification carbon capture. So I don't know, because I can't actually, I think, see everyone who's on the call. I'm not sure what the best way is to do this, but I don't know if there's maybe any direct questions. And if you put your hand up, I think Catherine can see and can unmute you. Catherine, are there any hands up? And if not, then I don't know if there's, sorry.
There aren't any hands up right now. Just to tell everybody, the hand function. Oh, yes, one has just popped up.
Gerald Page.
One
Great, Gerald. So if you just start as well by saying your name and where you're from and what you do.
Gerald Page, Equinox Energy Partners. I've lived and worked in 8 countries around the world in the last 20 years, focused on oceans, biodiversity, climate, renewable energy, clean tech focus. And the messaging behavioral change has always been an issue, and I think about that every day. I'm in my late 60s, so I'm a little older. I've been pushing the wheel around the planet for 20 years, without a lot of progress, obviously, in what's gone on in the world in COP16 and COP29. Unfortunately, we're just not making the progress. And I'm an advisor to the Kingdom of Tonga. I've been doing that for over a decade. And so ocean acidification is a real issue going forward. I do some advisory work for Mission Blue as well, Dr. Sylvia Earle, I'm sure some of you know. And, I think about the context of messaging when I think about COVID, right? And because during COVID, if you didn't wash, distance, or mask, death was in the equation, right? The chance of death was an exponential factor. And slowly around the world, everybody realized that death was in the equation. And behavioral change happened globally, slower in some places than others, but eventually everybody woke up to the issue of COVID and because death was in the equation. When we are in these other negotiations, what I've found is that we go back to the same rhetoric. We go back to ego, avarice, and basic lack of common sense. And if there's no common sense because death isn't in the equation, then I applaud all of you in what you do in communicating the urgency. But to me, it's behavioral change. How do we change the behavior because death is in the equation?
Great, that's a really interesting question. And I don't know if any of the speakers have any thoughts on this. I can see direct links there with what Liz has been speaking about, but probably all of you, in the ways that you communicate, how do you try and achieve that behavior?
I'll kind of tackle that first, if just to kind of respond to your great comments. I think a lot of what we need to focus on again is like that consequence, right? I think that's kind of what you're saying is like, what is the consequence of not taking action? Especially as people understand or can effectively communicate what the urgency is. And I think, in terms of like your comments about death being in the equation, for a lot of marine species that people care about, that's not necessarily the issue with ocean acidification. It's more these non-lethal impacts and cascading food web ecosystem impacts that we're, learning more and more about and can point to. So I think it's focusing on what those specific connections are to what people care about. And sometimes that's economic, sometimes that's health related. So, there's some work being done looking at the effects of ocean acidification on harmful algal blooms, for example. That is a health related issue, potential health related issue, and other things like that. So I think what I think we heard from a lot of our speakers today is that, focusing on what those impacts are and then providing people with, what is the tangible thing that they can do. Both in a community context, but also personally. And I think one thing that you can tell anyone that they can do, especially if you're communicating well, is everyone can share information and resources they learn, right? That's something that a school-age child can do. That's someone who's retired can do. That's what, anyone can do. And then also giving them these other actions, those calls to action that, say, Jessie was speaking about. So that's kind of how I would respond to what you were saying. It can be hard to impress upon people the urgency and the actual fact that ocean acidification impacts are happening now, and to point out things that connect with people on that personal level, so they feel invested.
Can I just have one perspective from the Alliance. So that aspect of behavior change is something that we have recently. So I showed some of our first iterations of this like new creative communications approach that we're trying to develop, because it's kind of like going back to that issue that you mentioned of behavior change, in the sense that knowledge on itself doesn't lead to action, right? So our main audience, our main constituency, as you can see, Jessie's there in COP, is policymakers. And we have been developing like a very science communication approach and very policy focused approach. But for next year, and this year and next year, we're trying to experiment to complement that messaging with something that, as you can see, we're addressing more the emotions, like more like what connects us all, that we're all humans and that we get moved by different things. It can be exploring arts or exploring immersive experiences that show our audience what it feels or what, like, you know, like explaining OA and explaining climate ocean impacts in a different way, in a more like creative way, and using like a multidisciplinary approach, working with artists, working with social scientists to help us like innovate in the way that we are communicating, so that like we don't run out of time, basically. So hopefully next year we can come with more like bigger examples of how we're doing this, but we're like cooking some ideas of like using film to show the people who are being affected or people who are doing things to solve this that maybe we don't know. So yeah, so it's just like one other approach that we're taking on basically on using this urgency and just being more creative on how we do our communications approach.
Great, thank you. So moving on to sort of the next question, what are your biggest challenges with communicating OA? And there's obviously a lot of sort of challenges that we all share, a few maybe more unique ones, but is there anyone that would like to sort of speak about a particular challenge that they have come across that maybe they'd like to get advice on here now, or just maybe they found a way around it themselves that they'd like to share with everyone else on the call? Yeah, Catherine, again, if you could just let me know if there's any hands up, that'd be great.
Yes, I can do that.
Thank you. So we've got here, obviously, things like the complexity of the topic, that's quite intangible. So I think we've touched on that quite a lot today, and hopefully some new ideas there, how to make it more tangible, have come up. I'm always hesitant about being quoted and taken out of context or trick questions. That's an interesting one. I really can, I resonate with that. I think especially over the years, because I've seen it myself, where I feel like I kind of question what people are saying. I worry that what I say might be taken out of context. So I think that's a really, really interesting one. And that resources are lacking. Okay, yeah, I see that, and that's, I think, something that we're working on. And Catherine, sorry,
Yes.
you made a
Natalie Fox, if you would like to raise your hand, otherwise I'll just read from the box. But there is a question in the question and answer box.
great.
All right, it says, oh, okay, Natalie, I'll let you go ahead.
Hi, Natalie, nice that you joined the call. Natalie is a working group member of OARS 6 as well, so it's nice that you were able to make it.
Hello, can you? Oh, hi. Can you
Hi.
hear me? Hi.
Yes.
Hi, Amy. Hi. Thank
Hi.
you. Hi. Thank you so much. This has been really, really great. The connecting area between OA research and science and communications. And so my question is about citizen science. So I'm starting to explore other challenges or issues in my local area and sort of initiating social citizen science projects like around microplastics. But do you have any methods or any other projects that you could kind of suggest that I look to start talking about this specific topic in the local community? So I'm working with surfers in particular. So it's something that is not talked about, and it always comes back to things that we can see or things that we kind of know. But I'd really like to be able to engage surfers more in OA, and especially in some sort of monitoring or data collection.
Hi, Natalie. It's Liz, and I'd love to chat with you about this. You know, before I worked for NOAA, I used to be a shellfish resource manager, and we found that local organizations, like here in the US, there's organizations like Surfrider Foundation that would be like that particular audience that you mentioned, that were already engaged in kind of ocean policy and ocean issues. So there may be local organizations or regional organizations that you can connect where, you know, that particular audience might be working with, and then kind of working with them on, you know, what kind of information you might they might be interested in helping collect, or, you know, what issues that you know, that they might have. Often they're access issues, often it's water quality issues, and then those are on-ramps by which you can connect ocean acidification with those other topics. So I think a lot of it is when we assess needs for different audiences that might be not our typical targets for ocean acidification information, we figure out what is it they care about, and then we find where ocean acidification might have a connection to that they may not be aware. So I would suggest that. In terms of you know, other types of citizen science projects, you know, I'm happy to speak with you more about this, but we do fund some community science projects as part of our education and outreach funding. And so, you know, like we've worked with indigenous groups in Alaska that do their own monitoring within a larger network. We've done the development of a tool called the Fighter to measure pH that was specifically designed for community science. And that kind of rose out of that need. So there's lots of different ways that you can engage different groups. But I recommend trying to build relationships with the trusted community members or organizations by which these people already participate.
Great. I'd love to talk to you further if that's possible. Yeah.
Just adding to that, Natalie, are you still focusing on Portugal, or is it also the UK?
I'm in Portugal, so it's easier, but
Yeah.
UK is still possible as well.
Yeah, because I mean, the thing is, you know, obviously in England we've got Surfers Against Sewage, and you know, although there's like sort of the ocean acidification, there's also coastal acidification, which can be more extreme due to things like sewage input. So sometimes I think it's also interesting, like a bit like what Liz said about sort of connecting or linking into issues that people are already concerned about, and of course sort of adding that messaging of it's not just, you know, bad for our health and bad for our ecosystems in the way that we're maybe thinking about it right now, but also the raw sewage that we're letting into the ocean also can create sort of more local acidification. So maybe finding sort of that messaging and just connecting with those organizations that already have a really loud voice, and maybe kind of adding that to it to bring sort of more awareness around that, and put more pressure on, or more reasons why the government should be acting on these issues might be an angle. But I think this would be a really interesting conversation. And also I know we've got Carla Berghoff as well, who works with divers on a citizen science project. So maybe we can connect there as well and get some inspiration there.
Yeah, fantastic.
Hope
Thank
that
you.
helps. Great. So I think we've got 2 more minutes, so maybe we'll go with if anyone has any questions regarding sort of specifically communicating with governments. Are there any questions there that we can discuss? And everyone's contact details will also be available, as well as you can just reach out to me. And I can put you in touch with the right person if after the session you have some questions or are looking to collaborate. So there'll be more opportunities there to ask your questions. But yeah, anything on sort of communicating with governments or policymakers?
I think there's a question in the Q&A that was focused on
Great.
this. How can we communicate effectively with people like politicians who don't easily understand science, even science-minded people who still won't believe that it's actually happening, like OA? And I responded to that because we're down to our last minute, but again, putting that focus on the impacts and consequences to species, industries, communities that are important to the people that these politicians serve. So that's what I recommend. And I think that Jessie would also say, like, make sure you have the ask that might already fit into initiatives that these particular politicians care about. So do your homework, and then fitting in on, like, how is this a value add? That, you know, or ocean, you know, the actions you're already doing are also helping OA. And so that's another feather in your cap if you continue to support this. And Hula also put in those worksheets to help you start thinking about that and working through that issue into that chat too.
Okay,
Yes,
thank you. Okay, well, then I think, yeah, we are down to our last minute. So I just want to say another big thank you to all the speakers today. It's been really interesting. Thanks for joining. Thank you to Catherine and Katharina and Elise from the GOA-ON Secretariat for organizing OA Week. It's a really interesting week, and I think there's so much to learn. So also have a look at the other sessions. There'll be lots more throughout the week. And thank you everyone for joining and for participating and sort of sharing your thoughts and ideas with us. And if you do have any other thoughts that you want to share with us, please do get in touch through OARS. We have a working group both on policy engagement, science to action, and also public awareness. So if this is something that you'd like to get more involved in, please get in touch. Maybe with me. I'll just put my email in the chat. And yeah, hopefully we'll be working together in the future in whatever capacity that is. So thank you so much, and have a lovely day, evening, morning, whatever you are in the world. Thank you.